The air in the shadowed vale was a dead thing. It didn't move. It didn't carry the scent of pine or damp earth. It was a cold, stagnant presence that clung to the skin like a burial shroud. Silas Kane, a man who had seen the worst of humanity at Antietam, felt a primal fear coiling in his gut, a fear more profound than any cannon fire or bayonet charge. His compass, a reliable brass companion that had guided him through war and wilderness, was useless. The needle spun in lazy, erratic circles, a victim of some unseen sickness in the earth itself. The silence was the worst part. An hour ago there had been the frantic sounds of their retreat, the snapping of twigs, their own ragged breaths. Now there was nothing, no bird song, no rustle of squirrels. The entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. He risked a glance at Jedediah Boone, who was huddled at the base of a monstrous, soot-black oak. The boy's face was ashen, his eyes wide with a terror that bordered on madness. He was muttering a prayer, his words a desperate, trembling whisper against the oppressive quiet. Tobias was gone. One moment he was there, the quiet tracker moving like a ghost through the undergrowth, and the next he had simply vanished. There was no scream, no sound of a struggle. He was just erased from the world. But it was the other sound that had finally broken them. A soft, wet, rhythmic thump. It was coming from somewhere above them, in the impossibly thick canopy of branches that blotted out the gray Appalachian sky. It sounded like a butcher chopping meat. Silas raised his rifle, the cold metal a poor comfort. He knew, with a certainty that froze the marrow in his bones, that they were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. And the thing that was stalking them through these forbidden woods was something that had no name in any language known to man. To understand the horrifying chain of events that led Silas Kane and his companions into that cursed hollow, we must rewind. We must travel back to the fall of 1876, to a small, isolated settlement nestled deep in the unforgiving mountains of West Virginia. The town was called Hemlock Hollow, a name that proved to be a grim prophecy. Life here was a constant struggle against the elements, a brutal negotiation with a land that was both provider and executioner. The scars of the Civil War were still fresh, etched not just on the landscape but on the souls of the men who had returned from it. The community was a fragile thing, held together by shared hardship, deep-rooted faith, and an even deeper-rooted superstition. In these remote pockets of Appalachia, the old ways, the old stories brought over from the moors of Scotland and the dark forests of Germany, had not died. They had merely taken root in the new, wild soil. People spoke of haints and raven mockers in hushed tones, and they knew that there were certain places in the mountains that were best left alone, places where the veil between the world of the living and the world of something else was perilously thin. Hemlock Hollow was surrounded by such places. The town itself sat in a valley, but looming over it to the north was a ridge, and beyond that ridge lay a section of primeval forest that the locals called the Shadowed Vale. It was a place banned by generations of oral tradition. They said the sun never truly touched the ground there, that game animals who wandered in never wandered out, and that the very trees seemed to watch you with a silent, ancient malevolence. It was a place of dark legend, a geographical curse on their doorstep. And it was in this place that the macabre story of the Hemlock Hollow hunters would find its horrifying conclusion. The three men who would dare to defy that curse were the backbone of the settlement's survival. Silas Kane was their unofficial leader. A man in his late 30s, he carried himself with the quiet, weary authority of a former Union sergeant. He was pragmatic, resourceful, and had little patience for what he called mountain talk and ghost stories. He believed in what he could see, touch, and put in his rifle sights. The war had burned the superstition out of him, replacing it with a grim understanding of the tangible horrors men were capable of. He was respected, if not always liked, for his steady hand and clear head in a crisis. Then there was Jedediah Boone, the youngest of the trio. Barely 20, Jedediah was the opposite of Silas. He was a product of the mountains, born and bred in the folklore of Hemlock Hollow. He had grown up on tales of the Wampus Cat and the Spearfinger Witch. For him, the supernatural was not a matter of belief, but an accepted part of the natural world. He was a superb hunter, but his skills were always guided by the rituals and superstitions of his ancestors. He would never hunt on a Sunday, and he would always leave a small portion of the kill for the spirits of the woods. His faith in these traditions was as unshakable as Silas's skept. Icism, the final member of their party, was Tobias Finch. Quiet, observant, and wiry, Tobias was the tracker. He was a man of few words who seemed more at home in the silent company of the forest than he did in the town tavern. He could read the landscape like a book, noticing a broken twig or a scuffed patch of moss that others would overlook. He was the one who could follow a trail that had seemingly vanished. It was this unique combination of skills, Silas's leadership, Jedediah's instinct, and Tobias's perception, that made them the most successful hunting party in the county. But it was a combination that would soon be tested against a darkness far older and more patient than any of them could possibly imagine. The fourth figure in this disturbing tableau was a woman known only as Elspeth Blackwood. She was not a native of Hemlock Hollow. She had arrived a decade prior, a lone widow whose husband had supposedly perished in a mining accident further east. She didn't settle in the town itself, but instead chose to inhabit a derelict, long-abandoned cabin on the slopes leading up to the forbidden shadowed vale. Her proximity to the cursed woods was the first black mark against her name. She kept to herself, emerging only to trade expertly crafted herbal remedies and tinctures for supplies she couldn't grow or make herself. Her knowledge of plants was uncanny. She could soothe a colicky baby with a poultice or break a fever with a bitter tea, skills that should have made her a respected healer. But in the suspicious, insular world of Hemlock Hollow, her knowledge was seen as unnatural. It was whispered that her remedies were a little too effective, that her understanding of the forest's secrets was not something a good, God-fearing woman should possess. She was gaunt and weathered, with eyes as dark and deep as a forest pool at midnight. She moved with a strange, silent grace, and more than one townsman swore they had seen her walking the woods at night, speaking to things that were not there. Rumors began to fester like untended wounds. They said she could sour a cow's milk with a glance. They said she could call down blight upon a neighbor's crops. When a child went missing for a few hours, only to be found asleep in a field, panicked whispers pointed to Elspeth Blackwood. She was a witch, they murmured, a practitioner of the dark arts who had made a pact with whatever malevolent entity resided in the shadowed vale. There was no proof, of course, only fear, suspicion, and the human need for a scapegoat in a world filled with hardship. The winter of 1876 descended upon Hemlock Hollow not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as an iron fist. It came early and with a savage, unrelenting fury. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, suffocating snow choked the valleys and sealed the mountain passes. For a community that depended on the autumn hunt to lay in stores for the cold months, it was a catastrophe. The deer, the rabbits, the squirrels, they all seemed to vanish. Hunting parties, led by Silas and the others, would spend days trekking through the frozen wilderness, only to return empty-handed and frostbitten, their powder and shot wasted. The usual hunting grounds were eerily silent, devoid of any tracks or signs of life. The silence that would later terrify Silas in the shadowed vale was first born in these barren, snow-covered woods. As the weeks dragged on, desperation began to set in. Rations dwindled. The gaunt, hollow-eyed look of hunger became commonplace. The children's laughter faded, replaced by weak, persistent coughs. The town's prayers seemed to freeze in the air, unheard. It was in this climate of cold, gnawing fear that suspicion turned its malevolent gaze toward Elspeth Blackwood. While the town starved, she survived. She was seen, on rare occasions, from a distance, a lone, dark figure moving against the white landscape. She didn't look starved. She didn't look desperate. This simple fact that she was enduring when they were all suffering was enough to condemn her in their minds. How could she be finding food where the best hunters in the region could not? The question hung in the frigid air of every cabin, and the answer that began to take shape was a dark and terrifying one. She wasn't hunting the game. She was commanding it, cursing their lands, hoarding the animals for herself, using her forbidden knowledge to feast while they wasted away. The creeping, macabre idea was planted. She had to be stopped. The breaking point came on a bitterly cold evening in late November. Jedediah Boone burst into the town's small, smoke-filled tavern, his face pale and his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. He had been checking his trap lines near the edge of the woods bordering Elspeth's property, a fruitless and desperate task. As dusk fell, he had seen her. She was returning from the direction of the shadowed vale, a heavy burlap sack slung over her shoulder. He had hidden, watching her pass. There was no blood on her clothes, he insisted, no sign that she had been dressing a deer or any large animal. Yet the sack was full, and she moved with a purpose that spoke of a successful journey, not a failed hunt. The tavern fell silent as he spoke, every man hanging on his words. This was the proof they needed. Their fear and hunger coalesced into a single, sharp point of righteous anger. It was one thing to be a reclusive outcast. It was another to use dark powers to steal the food from the mouths of starving children. The whispers that had once been confined to shadowy corners now became open declarations. She was a witch. She had laid a curse on their hunting grounds. The town preacher, a fire and brimstone man named Reverend Miller, fanned the flames. He spoke of the devil's minions walking the earth, of the righteous duty to root out evil wherever it may hide. The atmosphere grew thick with a dangerous, volatile energy. A mob mentality began to take hold, fueled by weeks of cold and hunger. They spoke of marching to her cabin, of demanding she lift her curse, of burning her out if she refused. It was a path that led to fire and ropes, and a kind of darkness that would stain the soul of the entire community. This was the moment where history could have taken a very different and much bloodier path. It was Silas Kane who stood against the tide of hysteria. He entered the tavern just as the talk of torches and pitchforks reached its fever pitch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence was enough to command a nervous silence. He listened to Jedediah's story, his face an unreadable mask. While the others saw proof of witchcraft, Silas saw something else, a mystery. If Elspeth Blackwood had found a pocket of the forest where game was still plentiful, that was a resource, not a curse. He was a man who believed in solutions, not superstitions. To him, burning a woman on the basis of panicked rumors was not just wrong, it was inefficient. It wouldn't fill their empty bellies. He proposed a different course of action, a plan born of pragmatism, not panic. He, Jedediah, and Tobias would go. They would not confront her, not yet. They would follow her. They would track her back to her secret hunting ground and discover the truth for themselves. If she was indeed consorting with dark powers, they would be the ones to deal with it. But if she had simply found a hidden valley, a place the deer had migrated to for the winter, then they would share in that bounty and save the town. His logic was a splash of cold water on their heated passions. It was a sensible plan, a hunter's plan. It appealed to their need for action but steered them away from the immediate, irreversible violence of a witch hunt. The men grumbled, but they agreed. The decision was made. The three best hunters in Hemlock Hollow would venture into the forbidden woods, into the shadow of the witch's cabin, and unravel her macabre secret. They believed they were undertaking a mission of survival. None of them could have possibly comprehended that they were, in fact, walking into their own meticulously prepared graves. Before we follow them into those dark woods, it's crucial to understand the very real terror that places like the Shadowed Vale inspired. If you find these deep dives into forbidden history and macabre folklore as compelling as I do, consider subscribing to the channel. Every story we unearth is a forgotten piece of a much larger, more disturbing puzzle, and what awaits these hunters is darker than any rumor the town could have conceived. Your support allows us to continue digging up these banned histories and cold cases that time has tried to bury. Now back to the encroaching darkness. The folklore of Appalachia is rich with tales of malevolent entities. These weren't just campfire stories. To people like Jedediah, they were field guides to survival. They spoke of the Tilanua, giant mythical birds that could carry off a child. They warned of the Uctina, a horned serpent with a blinding crystal in its forehead. But more relevant to the deep woods were the stories of the raven Macabre, witches who could steal the very life force from the sick and dying. They could shapeshift, travel as fiery or shadowy forms, and were invisible to all but the most powerful medicine men. The fear of such beings was palpable. It dictated where you could build your home, which paths you could walk after dark, and what rituals you must perform to protect your family. The Shadowed Vale was believed to be the home of such entities, a place where the natural laws were suspended. This was the psychological landscape through which the three hunters would have to travel. For Silas, it was an inconvenience, a set of spooky stories to be ignored. For Jedediah, it was a very real and present danger, a spiritual battlefield where his prayers were his only armor. And for Tobias, the silent tracker, the truth would lie somewhere in Bitwa. In the things he could see, and the things he could feel, a creeping dread that defied both logic and legend. They set out at dawn under a sky the color of old pewter. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, a pristine white canvas that would make tracking Elspeth's movements a simple task, or so they thought. They carried with them their long rifles, bedrolls, and enough salted pork and hardtack for 3 days. It was a short expedition, Silas had reasoned. Follow her, find the game, and return. Simple. The journey to the edge of Elspeth's property was familiar, a well-trodden path through woods they knew as well as their own backyards. But the moment they crossed the unseen boundary onto the lands that sloped up toward the Shadowed Vale, the atmosphere changed. It was an immediate and deeply unsettling shift. The sparse birdsong they had heard earlier ceased entirely. The air grew still and heavy, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. The forest here was older, the trees more gnarled and menacing. Their branches, heavy with snow, clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. It was Tobias who found her trail first. He knelt, pointing a gloved finger at a series of footprints heading north, deeper into the forbidden territory. They were small, the prints of a lone woman. But as he followed the trail, his brow furrowed in confusion. He called Silas and Jedediah over, his voice a low whisper. He pointed to another set of tracks, running parallel to Elspeth's. They were bizarre, unlike anything he had ever seen. They were barefoot, humanoid, but the toes were too long and the stride was unnaturally wide. And stranger still, they seemed to press only lightly into the deep snow, as if whatever made them was impossibly light, or was not fully touching the ground. Jedediah's face went pale. He recognized the description from a forbidden tale his grandmother used to tell him, the story of the Nanehi, the spirit people who walk between worlds. Silas merely grunted, dismissing it as a trick of the light, a deformity in the snow. But even he felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The hunt had just begun, and already it was veering into the realm of the creepy and the unknown. They pressed on, following the dual set of tracks deeper into the oppressive silence. The sun, a weak, watery disk in the sky, seemed to have no effect here. The shadows cast by the ancient hemlocks and twisted oaks were long and unnaturally dark, even at midday. An hour into their trek, they began to find the symbols. The first one was carved into the trunk of a massive, lightning-scarred pine. It was a complex geometric shape like a spidery snowflake, etched deep into the bark. It looked fresh. A few hundred yards later, they found another, a bundle of sticks and crow feathers, woven together with what looked like human hair and tied to a low-hanging branch. They were markers creating a clear perimeter, but they didn't feel like trail markers. They felt like warnings, wards. Jedediah recognized them as a variation of hex signs, but they were twisted, malevolent versions of the protective symbols his people used. These were not meant to keep evil out. They looked as though they were designed to keep something in. Silas, ever the pragmatist, tried to find a logical explanation. Perhaps it was just Elspeth's way of marking her territory, a scarecrow tactic to keep nosy townsfolk away. But the craftsmanship was intricate, the placements deliberate. There was a disturbing intentionality to them that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Tobias, meanwhile, noticed something else. Around each symbol the snow was disturbed, littered with the tracks of small animals, rabbits, squirrels, foxes. But the tracks all led away from the symbols. It was as if every creature in this forest knew to give these strange totems a wide berth. The hunters, however, did not have that luxury. Their mission and the trail of Elspeth Blackwood led them directly through this corridor of creepy, silent warnings, deeper into the heart of the vale. As they ventured past the perimeter of woven symbols, the forest floor began to change. The clean, white snow gave way to patches of exposed earth, black and strangely barren, as if the ground itself was blighted. And it was here that they made their first truly macabre discovery. Lying in a small clearing was the carcass of a large buck. It was a magnificent animal, one that could have fed a family for a week. But their initial rush of excitement died in their throats as they drew closer. The deer had not been killed by a predator or a hunter's bullet. There were no claw marks, no entry wounds. Its throat had been torn out, but not by teeth. It was a clean, almost surgical wound. More disturbing, however, was its position. The animal had been deliberately arranged, its legs tucked neatly beneath it, its head placed on a bed of pine boughs facing east. It was an offering, a sacrifice, a cold dread. Far more chilling than the winter air, began to seep into the men. A short distance away they found another, a fox, laid out in a similar ritualistic fashion. And then a hawk, its wings spread as if in flight, pinned to the ground with sharpened sticks. This was not the work of a simple hunter. This was a place of ritual, of a dark and bloody religion whose tenets were utterly alien to them. Jedediah was now openly praying, his hand clutching a small wooden cross he wore around his neck. Even Silas had no logical explanation for this. The sheer, methodical strangeness of it all was beginning to erode his skepticism. This wasn't just a woman with a secret hunting spot. They had stumbled into something else entirely, something ancient and horrifying. The silence of the woods no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. And for the first time, all three men had the distinct and terrifying feeling that they were trespassing on consecrated and profoundly unholy ground. The psychological toll of their discoveries was beginning to wear on the party. The unity they shared was fracturing under the strain of fear and uncertainty. Jedediah was becoming a liability. Every snapping twig was a spirit, every shadow a monster. He argued that they should turn back, that they were meddling with forces beyond their understanding. He claimed the ritualistic animal carcasses were offerings to the entity of the veil, and that by trespassing, they were inviting its wrath upon themselves. He reminded Silas of the old laws, the forbidden pacts between men and the spirits of the deep woods. They had broken the pact. Silas, though deeply unnerved, refused to be swayed by what he still considered superstitious panic. Their town was starving. The image of the hollow-eyed children of Hemlock Hollow was a more potent motivator than any ghost story. He argued that the bizarre displays were just more of Elspeth's scare tactics, elaborate and macabre tricks designed to protect her territory. He clung to his rational explanation like a drowning man to a log, because the alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. Tobias remained silent, caught between the two extremes. His tracker's mind was cataloging the evidence, and the evidence didn't fit either narrative completely. The tracks, the symbols, the ritualized kills, they formed a picture that was both methodical and insane. He didn't speak of spirits or witches, but he knew, with an animal instinct he had learned to trust above all else, that they were in terrible danger. The longer they stayed in this place, the lower their chances of ever leaving. The tension between the three men was now a palpable thing, as thick and suffocating as the forest's silence. They were a small, isolated island of flickering humanity in a vast, dark ocean of the unknown. Pushing deeper, they followed the trail up a steep, rocky incline. The trees grew closer together here, their branches interlocking to form a dense, gloomy canopy that plunged the forest into a perpetual twilight. It was here that Tobias, moving ahead of the others, suddenly froze. He raised a hand, signaling for silence. Silas and Jedediah crept forward, rifles at the ready. Tobias pointed down at the snow. There, pressed perfectly into a fresh drift, was another set of the strange, long-toed footprints. But this time they were not walking. They were the prints of something that had been crouching, waiting, and next to them something that made Silas's blood run cold, the distinct impression of a human knee. And another. Someone had been kneeling in the snow, right beside the creature that made the tracks. The implication was horrifying. Elspeth was not just being followed by these things, she was meeting with them, interacting with them. The scene painted a disturbing picture. The Witch of the Vale, kneeling in the snow, communing with some unknown entity from the deep woods. The skepticism that had anchored Silas was finally and irrevocably shattered. There was no rational explanation for this. They were far beyond the realm of simple poaching or scare tactics. Jedediah let out a choked sob, convinced now that they were on the trail of a woman who had sold her soul, and that the things she communed with were demons made flesh. He begged Silas to turn back, to leave this cursed place to its unholy guardians. But for Silas, turning back was no longer an option. They had seen too much. To leave now, without understanding what was happening, felt like abandoning their town to a threat they couldn't even name. Driven by a grim, terrifying new purpose, he gave the order to move forward. They were no longer just looking for food, they were hunting a monster. As dusk began to bleed its purple and gray hues across the sky, they reached the crest of the ridge. And there, nestled in the hollow below, they saw it. A thin, pale wisp of smoke rising into the still air. It was a chimney. They had found her cabin. Creeping to the edge of the ridge, they lay flat on their stomachs, peering down into the clearing. The cabin was a crude, ramshackle affair, built of dark, weathered logs and chinked with mud and moss. It looked as if it had grown out of the earth itself. A single, grimy window glowed with a faint, flickering orange light from within. The clearing around it was barren, the snow trampled down in a chaotic mess of footprints, Elspeth's, and the other inhuman ones. There was no woodpile, no tanning rack, no sign of the normal activities of a person living off the land. The entire scene felt profoundly wrong. They decided to wait for the cover of full darkness before making their approach. The plan was to get close enough to peer through the window to finally see what secrets the Witch of the Vale was hiding. As they lay there in the freezing cold, the silence of the woods was broken by a new sound. It was a voice coming from the cabin. Elspeth's voice. She was singing. But it was no hymn or folk song. It was a strange, discordant lullaby, a melody that seemed to have too many and too few notes at the same time. It was a deeply unsettling sound, ancient and sorrowful. And beneath her voice they could hear another sound, a faint, rhythmic scratching like rats scrabbling behind a wall. The hunters exchanged nervous glances. The stage was set for the final, horrifying revelation. They were about to look through the devil's keyhole, and the sight that awaited them would forever scorch itself upon their souls. Under the shroud of a moonless, starless night, they made their move. They descended the ridge with the agonizing slowness of men trying to walk on broken glass, every step a calculated risk. The cold was a physical pain now, a sharp, brittle ache in their bones. As they reached the edge of the clearing, the scratching sound from within the cabin grew louder, more insistent. It was accompanied by a low, guttural chattering, a sound that was disturbingly, sickeningly close to human speech, but twisted and malformed. Silas led the way, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He crept toward the single glowing window, his rifle held tight against his chest. Jedediah followed, his face a mask of pure terror, muttering prayers under his breath. Tobias moved to the side, his keen eyes scanning the dark perimeter of the woods, a silent sentinel against the encroaching dread. The discordant lullaby continued, rising and falling in its alien cadence. Silas reached the wall of the cabin. The logs were cold and slimy to the touch, coated in a layer of perpetual dampness. He took a deep, steadying breath, the frigid air burning his lungs. This was it, the moment of truth. He slowly, carefully raised his head, inching his eyes above the level of the warped, grimy window frame. The light inside was dim, cast by a single sputtering tallow lamp that threw long, dancing shadows across the room. What he saw inside was not the lair of a witch brewing potions over a cauldron. The reality was infinitely more macabre, and so profoundly disturbing that for a moment his mind refused to process it. The truth of the shadowed veil, the secret of Elspeth Blackwood, was not about a curse. It was about a horrifying, unspeakable covenant. The interior of the cabin was sparse, almost bare. There was a rough-hewn table, a single chair, and a stone hearth where a small fire crackled. Elspeth Blackwood stood in the center of the room, her back to the window. The burlap sack Jedediah had seen her carrying was on the table, and it was now open. But it wasn't filled with game. It was filled with turnips, potatoes, and slabs of salted pork, supplies she had clearly traded for in a neighboring town, miles away. She wasn't a witch hoarding the forest's bounty. She was an importer of food. But it was not for whom she had brought the food, but what that shattered Silas's world. Huddled in the far corner of the cabin, away from the firelight, were figures. 3 of them. At first he thought they were starving, sickly children. They were small, emaciated, with skin the color of bone china stretched tight over their skeletal frames. Their hair was thin and white, and their limbs were unnaturally long and spindly. But then one of them turned its head toward the light, and Silas had to physically stifle a scream. Its eyes were massive, perfectly black, and devoid of any pupil or iris. They were the eyes of a deep-sea creature, of something that had evolved in absolute darkness. Its mouth was a wide, lipless slit that opened to reveal rows of small, needle-like teeth. They were not human. They were a grotesque parody of humanity, a horrifying branch of the evolutionary tree that should have been lopped off millennia ago. And Elspeth, she was talking to them, soothing them with that creepy, atonal lullaby as she placed a raw potato into one of the creature's long, 3-fingered hands. She wasn't their master. She was their caretaker, their warden. The horrifying truth, rashed down upon Silas with the force of a physical blow. The legends, the superstitions, they were all wrong. Elspeth Blackwood was not a witch cursing their land. She was a guardian performing a terrifying macabre balancing act. The creatures in her cabin were the true inhabitants of the shadowed vale. They were the reason the game had vanished. They were predators, relentlessly and efficiently hunting the forest into barrenness. They were the source of the strange tracks, the reason for the perimeter of warning symbols. The ritualistically placed animal carcasses weren't sacrifices to a dark god. They were peace offerings, left by Elspeth to sate the creature's hunger, to keep them from venturing further down the mountain toward Hemlock Hollow. She was protecting the town. She lived in isolation, embraced the terrifying reputation of a witch, and communed with these horrifying beings, all to keep her unsuspecting neighbors safe from the ravenous things that lived just beyond the ridge. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her secret wasn't a hunting ground. It was a prison, and she was the warden. The disappearing animals, the strange silence, the feeling of being watched, it was all them. They were the curse on the land. And Elspeth was the only thing standing between them and the vulnerable, starving people of the town below. The woman they had come to condemn was, in fact, their silent, unthanked savior, engaged in a lonely, terrifying, and utterly forbidden duty. Silas felt a wave of nausea and shame. They hadn't been hunting a witch. They had been about to destroy the very shield that protected them. Silas slowly backed away from the window, his mind reeling, his entire worldview shattered. He had to get Jedediah and Tobias to explain the horrifying, complex truth. They had to leave now and never speak of what they had seen. But as he turned, his boot snagged on an exposed root, half buried in the snow. He stumbled, catching himself before he fell, but the heavy rifle slung over his shoulder knocked against the cabin wall with a dull, resonant thud. The sound was not loud, but in the profound silence of the vale it was like a gunshot. Inside the cabin the lullaby stopped. The chattering ceased. An immediate, profound silence fell. And then it was broken. A sound that was not animal, not human, but something horribly in between. A high-pitched, piercing shriek of alarm that ripped through the night air and seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the hunters. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malevolence. Before Silas could even react, the cabin door burst open. Elspeth stood framed in the doorway, her face a mask of horror and despair. "Run!" she screamed, her voice filled with a terror that confirmed their worst fears. "You fools, you don't know what you've done." But it was too late. From the darkness within the cabin, the pale, skeletal figures scrambled out, moving with a fluid, insect-like speed that defied their emaciated frames. And it wasn't just them. From the surrounding woods, from holes in the ground and crevices in the rocks that the hunters hadn't even noticed, more of them began to emerge. Dozens of them. A whole colony. The silent, watchful forest had come alive, and it was hungry. The scene descended into absolute chaos. This is the last stop before we plunge into the final, horrifying moments of this cold case. If you're compelled by these untold stories and want to ensure they aren't lost to time, hit that like button and subscribe. The algorithm may try to bury these forbidden tales, but with your help, we can keep the light on them. Now, witness the end. The creatures poured from the earth like termites from a disturbed nest. They moved on all fours, their long limbs carrying them across the snow with an unnatural arachnidan grace. They were silent runners, their bare feet making almost no sound. The only noise was a terrifying series of clicks and guttural hisses they used to communicate, coordinating their attack. The three hunters, seasoned and skilled, were suddenly and completely outmatched. Their rifles were useless against the swarm. Tobias Finch, the silent tracker, was the first to fall. He was on the periphery, scanning the woods, and was overwhelmed from behind. He didn't even have time to scream. One moment he was there, a solid presence in the darkness, and the next he was dragged down by a flurry of pale limbs. The last thing Silas saw of him was his wide, terrified eyes before he was pulled, kicking into the writhing mass. A single, sickening, wet crunch echoed through the clearing, and then silence. Jedediah panicked. His faith, his superstitions, his courage, it all shattered. He fired his rifle blindly into the darkness, the muzzle flash illuminating a dozen fleeting, horrifying faces with their empty black eyes. Then he threw the weapon down and ran, a raw animal scream tearing from his throat. He sprinted back the wall. Why they came, a lone, desperate figure fleeing a tide of living nightmares. Silas Kane, the war veteran, did not run. His training, his experience in the face of overwhelming odds took over. He knew that to turn his back was to die. He stood his ground, back against a large oak at the edge of the clearing, and raised his rifle. He took aim at the nearest creature as it scrambled towards him and fired. The heavy lead ball struck it in the chest, throwing it backwards with a wet, pulpy thud. But for every one he might fell, three more took its place. They were a tide of pale flesh and gnashing teeth. He saw Elspeth, standing near her cabin, screaming at the creatures in a language that was not human, a series of sharp, guttural commands. She was trying to call them off to regain control, but it was useless. The hunter's presence, the scent of new blood, had triggered a feeding frenzy that her long, careful stewardship could no longer contain. A creature lunged at Silas from the side, its long, three-fingered claws swiping for his face. He parried with the stock of his rifle, cracking it across the thing's skull with a sickening crunch. He worked the lever to reload, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a soldier. But he was surrounded. The clicking and hissing were coming from all directions. They were in the trees above him, crawling along the branches. He was in a closing circle of death. He managed to fire one more shot before a creature leaped from a low-hanging branch onto his back, its needle-like teeth sinking into his shoulder. The pain was white-hot, blinding. He roared, a sound of fury and agony, and was dragged to the ground. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into a cacophony of pain and darkness was Elspeth Blackwood, her face streaked with tears, watching as the monsters she had tried to contain finally claimed their due. The fate of Jedediah Boone is a terrifying story in itself. He ran from the clearing with the singular, mindless focus of pure terror. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to get away from the horrifying chittering and the screams of his friends. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at his face, his lungs burning. He could hear them behind him, a faint, rustling sound that was always just out of reach, pacing him. They were toying with him. He ran for what felt like hours, deeper into the dark, labyrinthine woods of the shadowed vale. This is where we reconnect with the horrifying scene from the beginning of our story. The unnatural silence, the feeling of being watched. He eventually collapsed at the base of that soot-black oak, utterly spent, his mind fractured. He huddled there, lost and alone, listening to the whispers that weren't the wind and the rhythmic, wet-chopping sound from the canopy above. The creatures that had taken Tobias and Silas were now taking their time with him. The woods of the shadowed vale had become their personal hunting ground, and Jedediah was the last, terrified prey. What happened to him in those final moments is unknown. His end was a lonely, horrifying one, witnessed only by the ancient, indifferent trees and the things that called the vale home. He was a man who had lived his life by the old stories, and in the end he was consumed by a legend far more real and far more hungry than any he had ever been told. His body, like that of Tobias Finch, was never found. It was simply absorbed by the cursed earth of the vale, another secret the woods would keep. Back in Hemlock Hollow, the days turned into a week. The hunting party did not return. At first there was little concern. Silas, Jedediah, and Tobias were the best. If the hunt was difficult, they would take their time. But as the second week began, a nervous anxiety began to creep through the settlement. A heavy snowstorm blanketed the region, making any attempt at a search impossible for several days. When the storm finally broke, the town organized a search party. It was a half-hearted effort, comprised of men who were already weakened by hunger and now gripped by a growing dread. They were led by Reverend Miller, who carried a Bible in one hand and a shotgun in the other. They made their way toward the lands of Elspeth Blackwood, their fear a tangible thing in the cold air. They found the hunters' initial trail easily enough in the old snow. But as they crossed the invisible threshold into the woods bordering the shadowed vale, they too felt the unnerving change. The silence. The cold. The oppressive, watchful atmosphere. They found the first of the woven stick-and-bone symbols, and the men, already on edge, refused to go any further. They called out the names of the missing hunters, their voices sounding small and thin in the vast, silent woods. The only reply was the whisper of the wind through the pines. They found no tracks, no sign of a struggle, nothing. It was as if the three men had simply been erased from the face of the earth. The search party turned back, defeated and terrified, reporting that the woods had swallowed the hunters whole. The official story became that the men had gotten lost in the blizzard and succumbed to the elements. But everyone in Hemlock Hollow knew, deep in their bones, that it wasn't the weather that had taken them. It was the witch. What of Elspeth Blackwood? After the search party failed, a small, grim-faced posse led by Reverend Miller and emboldened by righteous fury decided to bypass the woods and take the long way around to her cabin. They were determined to get answers by force if necessary. They marched for a full day, their anger keeping them warm against the biting cold. When they finally arrived at the clearing on the edge of the shadowed vale, they found the cabin. It was empty, abandoned. There were signs of a struggle. The door was torn from its hinges. Inside, furniture was overturned, and dark, blackish stains that were definitely not soot marred the floorboards. But there was no sign of Elspeth or any other living soul. It looked as if the very thing she had tried to control had ultimately turned on her. Perhaps in her grief and despair at the chaos the hunters had unleashed, she had allowed herself to be taken. Or perhaps she had fled, knowing that her long, lonely vigil was over and that the creatures, now having tasted human flesh again, could no longer be contained by her meager offerings. Whatever the reason, she was gone. Elspeth Blackwood vanished from history as mysteriously as she had entered it. Her cabin was eventually burned to the ground by the townsfolk, a futile act of cleansing a place they now believed to be irrevocably tainted by evil. The witch was gone, but her curse, it seemed, remained. The shadowed vale was now more than just a place of dark legends. It was a place of proven, deadly horror. A place banned not by superstition, but by the fresh, raw memory of three good men who had walked into its depths and never returned. The winter of 1876 eventually broke, as all winters do. The spring thaw arrived, and with it, miraculously, the game returned to the forests around Hemlock Hollow. Deer, rabbits, and squirrels were suddenly plentiful again, as if a great pressure had been lifted from the land. For the starving people of the town, it was a sign of God's mercy. They believed that by driving out the witch, they had lifted her curse. The truth, of course, was far more disturbing. With their warden gone, and having been roused to a frenzy, the creatures of the vale had likely overhunted their own territory to the point of collapse, and had either starved, moved on to deeper, more remote wilderness, or gone back into a long hibernation deep beneath the earth. The town of Hemlock Hollow survived. It grew, and over the decades, the horrifying story of the lost hunters and the witch of the vale faded from memory into legend. It became a scary story told to frighten children, a local piece of macabre folklore divorced from its terrifying reality. The names Silas Kane, Jedediah Boone, and Tobias Finch were etched onto a small stone monument in the town cemetery, their official cause of death listed as lost to the winter, a quiet, dignified lie to cover a truth too monstrous to record. The shadowed vale remained a place of deep unease. No one ever built a home there. No one hunted there. Its reputation lingered, a permanent stain on the local geography. The forest reclaimed the land where Elspeth's cabin had stood, and the dark, ancient trees kept their horrifying secrets locked away in a silent, wooden embrace, waiting. For nearly 50 years, the story remained just that, a story, a creepy local legend. But in the 1920s, the advance of industry brought a timber company to the mountains around Hemlock Hollow. They were an outside company, with no knowledge of the local folklore and no respect for the invisible boundaries set by superstition. They saw the shadowed vale not as a cursed, forbidden place, but as an untapped resource of prime, old-growth timber. Their logging crews began to push into the edges of the vale, their saws a profane intrusion into the sacred, silent woods. The older residents of Hemlock Hollow warned them, telling them the old story of the hunters who had vanished, but the loggers, men of a more modern, cynical age, just laughed. They were men of steam and steel, not ghost stories. It was during this time that a logger, a man named Thomas Pell, made a discovery that dragged the old, cold case back into the light. While clearing brush deep in the vale, his shovel struck something hard. He dug it out of the earth and roots. It was a rifle. An old 19th century hunting rifle, its wooden stock rotted and its barrel almost completely rusted through. It was an artifact from a bygone era, but it was what he found on the stock that made him pause. The wood was so decayed that it was barely legible, but there, carved deeply into the grain, were 3 words, a desperate final message from a man long dead. The carving read, "Follow her." It was Silas Kane's rifle. The discovery sent a chill through the logging camp and breathed a terrifying new life into the old legend. The story wasn't just a story. This was physical proof, and it was a warning. The discovery of Silas Kane's rifle should have been a final, chilling punctuation mark on a long-closed case. But instead, it opened up a new, even more disturbing chapter. The logging company, despite the unease caused by the discovery, pressed on with their work. A few weeks after the rifle was found, one of the logging crews went missing. A team of 6 men, sent to survey a remote section deep within the heart of the shadowed vale, failed to report back at the end of the day. A search party was sent out the next morning. They followed the tracks of the men's truck to the end of a muddy logging road. From there, the men's footprints led into the woods. The searchers followed the trail for about a mile before they found the survey equipment. It was dropped in the middle of the path, as if the men had suddenly broken into a panicked run. There were signs of a massive struggle. The ground was torn up, and there were strange, dark stains on the fallen leaves that the searchers tried to convince themselves was not blood. But there were no bodies, and more disturbingly, there were no other tracks besides those of the 6 loggers. It was as if they had been attacked by something that left no trace, something that could move through the dense forest without touching the ground. The search was called off after 3 days. The 6 men were never seen or heard from again. They had vanished, just like the hunters 50 years before them. The logging company, facing a horrifying and unexplainable tragedy, abandoned its operations in the shadowed vale immediately. They packed up their equipment and left Hemlock Hollow, breaking their contracts and forfeiting a massive amount of profit. Whatever was in those woods, it was bad for business. The second vanishing, so many years after the first, solidified the shadowed vale's horrifying reputation. It was now seen as a place that was actively malevolent, a geographical predator that would periodically awaken to feed. The state eventually designated the entire region as a protected wilderness area, effectively making it illegal to develop or even enter. The official reason was to preserve a rare ecosystem, but the locals knew the truth. It was a quarantine. The ban signs posted at the edge of the woods were not just warnings against trespassing. They were modern-day hex signs, designed to keep people out for their own safety. The story became a famous piece of Appalachian folklore, a chilling tale of the unexplained. But over time, new, even more disturbing theories began to emerge. Some folklorists and historians who studied the case proposed a truly macabre idea. They looked at the cycles. The first incident in 1876 occurred during a time of extreme scarcity and starvation. The second, in the 1920s, happened during a period of intense disruption and intrusion by the logging company. What if the creatures, the pale things from the cabin, were not just mindless predators? What if they were intelligent or at least instinctual enough to understand threats? The theory suggests that Elspeth Blackwood hadn't just been a warden. She had been an emissary, an ambassador. She was part of a family or a lineage that had, for generations, maintained a secret, horrifying truce with the creatures. A pact that involved offerings and a promise of non-interference, in exchange for the creatures remaining hidden and not preying on the nearby human settlements. Her lullaby wasn't just to soothe them. It was a form of communication. This theory reframes the entire horrifying incident. The hunters, in their desperate and ignorant quest, didn't just stumble upon a monster's lair. They broke a century-old treaty. Their intrusion, their act of aggression, was seen by the creatures as a declaration of war. By killing one of them, Silas had voided the pact. Elspeth's despairing scream, "You don't know what you've done," takes on a new, more profound meaning. She wasn't just watching trespassers get their comeuppance. She was witnessing the complete and utter collapse of her life's work, the undoing of a delicate, generations-long peace that had kept the two worlds separate. Her disappearance then becomes not an act of being killed or fleeing, but perhaps a final, desperate act of sacrifice. Maybe she gave herself to the creatures as a final offering, a plea to restore the broken peace and spare the town below. It's a deeply disturbing thought, a lonely, thankless, and horrifying existence, dedicated to maintaining a fragile truce with a species of subterranean hominids, only to have it all destroyed by the very people she was trying to protect. The hunters of Hemlock Hollow weren't just victims of a monster. They were the catalysts for a much larger tragedy, the ones who inadvertently reignited a conflict between two worlds that should have remained forever separate. They followed a supposed witch into the woods, and in doing so, may have doomed the entire region by breaking a forbidden, sacred law they never even knew existed. And what of the creatures themselves? The story of the hunters of Hemlock Hollow bears a chilling resemblance to other dark legends from isolated mountainous regions around the world. In the folklore of Newfoundland, they speak of the adlet, monstrous human-dog hybrids that live in the remote wilderness. In the deserts of the American Southwest, there are Navajo tales of the Stikini, shape-shifting witch creatures that can take the form of owls. Nearly every culture has a story of a feral, monstrous other that lives just beyond the boundaries of civilization. Modern cryptozoology might try to label the creatures of the Vale as crawlers or unclassified hominids. But these labels are just attempts by our modern, rational minds to categorize something that defies categorization. The truth is likely far stranger and more horrifying. Were they a remnant population of a proto-human species that was driven underground by the rise of Homo sapiens? Were they a product of extreme, long-term genetic isolation in the labyrinthine cave systems that riddle the Appalachian Mountains? Or were they something else entirely? Something not of this world, something that found its way here long ago and has been waiting patiently in the dark, silent places of the earth. The fact that Elspeth could seemingly communicate with them suggests a level of intelligence, a culture, a social structure that is utterly alien to our own. We are left with the chilling realization that we may not be the only intelligent species to walk this planet. We are simply the ones who live in the sun. The others, the pale, black-eyed others, have been content to wait in the darkness beneath our feet. The legacy of this macabre cold case is one of profound and lingering dread. It serves as a stark reminder that there are still mysteries in this world, places where the maps are blank and the old stories hold more truth than we are comfortable admitting. The shadowed vale exists today, a quiet, beautiful, and deeply menacing expanse of untouched wilderness. Hikers on the Appalachian Trail sometimes report strange feelings when they pass near the area. A sudden, inexplicable cold, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, or the hearing of faint, chittering whispers on the wind that are quickly dismissed as the sounds of insects or birds. The official story of the lost hunters and the vanished loggers remains just that, an official story. The files are closed, the case is cold. But the truth, the real, horrifying truth, lies buried under a century of soil and silence. It lingers in the rusted metal of a forgotten rifle, in the memory of a creepy, discordant lullaby, and in the dark, unexplored places of the earth. It's a truth that speaks of ancient pacts, forbidden knowledge, and the terrifying fragility of the world we think we know. It reminds us that humanity's dominion over this planet is a recent, and perhaps temporary, arrangement. We are merely the current tenants of the sunlit rooms, blissfully unaware of what might be stirring in the cellar below. The story is a permanent, creepy fixture in the lore of unexplained disappearances, a testament to the fact that sometimes the monster in the story is not the witch, but the ignorance of the men who hunt her. The most disturbing question left by this entire affair is a simple one. What was the true nature of Elspeth Blackwood's relationship with the creatures? The town saw her as a witch, their master. Seelas revised that theory, seeing her as their warden, their zookeeper. The later folklore theory paints her as an ambassador, a keeper of a fragile peace. But what if all of these are wrong? What if the relationship was something far more intimate, far more symbiotic, and far more horrifying? Consider the possibility that she was not their keeper but their shepherd, that she was not just providing them with food but was actively cultivating them. Why would she do this? Perhaps the creatures provided her with something in return: protection, knowledge, or perhaps the motivation was something far more primal. We know nothing of her life before she came to Hemlock Hollow. The story of a husband dead in a mining accident was her own unverified tale. What if she was not a widow but the last survivor of a family, a clan that had lived alongside these creatures for centuries? What if she was not fully human herself? This casts the entire narrative in a new, even more macabre light. The lullaby she sang was not for monsters, it was for her family. The food she brought was not a peace offering, it was a simple act of providing for her own. The hunter's intrusion was not just a breaking of a pact, it was a home invasion. And the horrifying, violent response of the creatures was not a mindless feeding frenzy. It was a calculated, defensive act of protecting their own matriarch. This theory, while speculative, fits the horrifying facts in a deeply unsettling way. It would explain her profound knowledge of the veil, her ability to communicate with the creatures, and her decision to live in such a desolate, terrifying place. She wasn't an outcast, she was home. It also provides a potential answer to the most chilling mystery of all, her final fate. If she was one of them, or at least a revered part of their strange, subterranean society, she would not have been killed or have fled. After the massacre, after her horrifying purpose was exposed, she would have simply retreated with them, back into the darkness, back into the deep, warm earth, to the hidden burrows and lightless caverns where her true family awaited. She did not vanish. She simply went home. The thought is almost too disturbing to contemplate. A woman, seemingly human, living as the queen or mother of a colony of creatures from our darkest nightmares. It blurs the line between man and monster, between the natural and the supernatural, and leaves us with a profound sense of unease. It suggests that the greatest horrors are not the ones that come from other worlds, but the ones that have been living alongside us, hidden in plain sight, all along. The creepy case of the hunters who followed the witch into the woods becomes something more. It becomes the story of men who blundered into a secret, ancient, and horrifyingly functional family, and paid the ultimate price for their trespass. The story leaves us with a final, lingering image. It is the image of Silas Kane's rifle, resting against that tree for 50 years, waiting to be found. That final, desperate message, "Don't follow her," is a testament to his last moments of clarity. In the face of an unspeakable, worldview-shattering horror, his final act was not one of vengeance but of warning. He realized in the end that Elspeth was not the enemy. She was the gatekeeper. And by following her, by forcing her gate open, they had unleashed the apocalypse upon themselves. His warning was not about a witch. It was about a boundary between the world of the sun and the world of the dark, a boundary that Elspeth had spent her life maintaining, and that he and his companions had foolishly, tragically, and fatally crossed. The rifle is the only voice the victims of the 1876 incident ever had. It speaks from the grave, a silent, rusted scream of regret and terror. It is a warning that echoes down through the decades. Some doors are not meant to be opened, some secrets are not meant to be known, and there are some woods you should never, ever walk into. The cold case of the Hemlock Hollow hunters is, in the end, not a story about what happened to them. It is a story about what is still waiting patiently in the deep and silent places of the world for the next curious fool to come looking. Today, if you were to visit the area around what was once Hemlock Hollow, you would find a quiet, sleepy mountain town, modernized but still isolated. The locals, descendants of the original settlers, are wary of outsiders asking about the old stories. They will tell you it's just folklore, a spooky tale to drive tourism. But if you press them, if you earn their trust, they will tell you that the people who live on the north side of town, the side that faces the old vale, still have strange rules. They bring their pets and livestock indoors before nightfall, without fail. They hang bundles of herbs and iron charms over their doors. And on the coldest, stillest nights of winter, some claim you can still hear a faint, discordant melody drifting down from the high, dark ridges, a strange and sorrowful lullaby, sung by a voice that is not quite human, to soothe the things that sleep and dream in the cold earth below. The story is not over. A cold case is only cold because we have stopped looking. But the forces at play in this story have never stopped looking at us. They are patient, they are waiting, and they remember the taste of human blood. The hunters were a meal, the loggers were a warning. What will the next intrusion bring? The tale is a horrifying, perpetual question mark, a reminder that the past is never truly dead, and some curses are simply boundaries we are not meant to cross. Ultimately, the creepy case of the hunters who followed the witch into the woods is a perfect, horrifying example of a story where there are no true answers, only deepening layers of mystery and dread. Was Elspeth Blackwood a saint or a monster, a warden or a matriarch? Was she protecting humanity from the creatures, or protecting her monstrous family from humanity? The truth likely died with her, and with the men who made the fatal mistake of letting their desperation lead them past the point of no return. Their story serves as one of the most disturbing and enduring cold cases in Appalachian history. It's a tale woven from starvation, superstition, and a horrifying revelation that defies all rational explanation. It is a testament to the idea that the world is far older, stranger, and more crowded than we think. And that sometimes, when you stare into the abyss, something with too many fingers and eyes as black as a starless night stares back. The shadowed veil keeps its secrets, and the fate of Silas Kane, Jedediah Boone, and Tobias Finch remains a permanent, chilling warning, forever etched into the dark and forbidden history of the mountains.